All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive today that's going to take us right into the heart of education policy.
That's right.
But with a twist. We're not talking about new teaching methods or testing strategies, nothing like that. Instead, we're going all the way to the top,
To the top.
exploring a proposal to completely dismantle
Whoa.
the U.S. Department of Education. You heard that right.
Yeah.
No more federal Department of Education.
Big one.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
And this isn't just some fringe idea, right?
Yeah.
We're diving into a chapter from this book called Mandate for Leadership.
Yeah, it's a collection of policy blueprints, essentially.
Like a plan.
A roadmap.
Yeah, a roadmap for the next administration, maybe, to really shrink federal involvement in education dramatically.
Dramatically is right.
So let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Why would anyone want to eliminate the Department of Education in the first place? And what would that even look like? I mean, where do you even begin with something like that?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is the motivation behind it, right?
Yeah.
It really boils down to this core belief that education is best handled not from Washington, but closer to home, at the state and local level.
Closer to families.
Exactly. Closer to families, closer to the communities where those schools actually exist.
It makes sense on the surface, but is that really practical? I mean, the federal government plays a pretty big role in education, right?
Mm-hmm.
Funding, setting standards, all of that.
And that's exactly what they take issue with.
Okay.
They argue that the Department of Education has become this massive bureaucratic behemoth that's actually stifling innovation, not helping it, and creating this one-size-fits-all system that just doesn't work for the diverse needs of students across the country.
Okay, so less Washington, more local control.
Yeah.
I get the argument, but how do they actually propose to, like, dismantle a whole federal department? I mean, it's not like you just snap your fingers and it's gone, right?
No, you're absolutely right. It's a pretty complex process, and the chapter lays out a phased approach.
Okay, so lay it on me.
All right, so phase one is all about redistribution.
Redistribute.
Yeah, so think of it like rearranging the furniture before you do a major renovation, right?
Gotcha.
So they propose moving certain programs to other federal agencies that they see as a better fit.
Like what? What kind of programs are we talking about?
Well, for example, title funding, which provides support to schools in low-income areas, would be shifted to the Department of Health and Human Services.
Interesting.
The idea is that those agencies are already working on issues related to poverty and social services, so it makes sense to consolidate those efforts.
Okay, so they're not necessarily tossing everything out. They're just moving pieces around, right?
Exactly.
What happens in phase two?
Phase two is where the cuts really start to happen.
Okay.
They propose eliminating a number of programs altogether, programs that they deem unnecessary or duplicative.
What kind of programs?
Well, they specifically mention certain parts of Impact Aid, for instance, which is a program that provides funding to school districts affected by federal activities. So, for example, schools near military bases often receive Impact Aid, but under this proposal, that funding would come directly from the Department of Defense instead.
So instead of having this separate program, they're basically saying, okay, if the military is having an impact on these schools, the military should be responsible for funding them.
Exactly. They're streamlining things, getting rid of what they see as unnecessary layers of bureaucracy.
Okay, it's starting to make a little more sense, but what about all the funding that's left over? I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars here, right?
Oh, yeah. And that brings us to phase three, block grants.
Block grants.
The idea is to take all the remaining funding that was previously going to the Department of Education and give it to states in these big chunks with a lot more freedom to decide how to spend it. So basically they're saying, hey, states, you know your needs better than we do in Washington, so here's the money. You figure out how to best use it to improve education for your students.
Okay. More freedom for states, less federal control. It sounds good in theory, but couldn't this lead to an even bigger gap between, like, well-funded schools in wealthy areas and struggling schools in poorer communities? How would they address that? I mean, that's a huge concern, right?
It is, and they argue that states can address those equity issues through their own policies, like targeted funding for disadvantaged students.
Okay.
And by expanding school choice options, which we'll talk about in more detail later on.
Okay, so less federal oversight, more local control. I'm starting to get the picture, but what about potential downsides?
Of course.
Couldn't this lead to, like, a patchwork of different standards and approaches across the country? Some states might prioritize STEM education, while others might focus more on vocational training, for example,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, and one of the key arguments against this approach.
Right.
Critics worry about a potential decline in national standards and a widening gap in the quality of education between states. They argue that a strong federal role is necessary to ensure equity and opportunity for all students, regardless of where they live.
So it's this tug of war,
Yeah.
right, between those who favor local control and those who believe in a stronger federal role in setting standards and ensuring equal access.
Exactly.
And to really understand the implications of this proposal, we need to zoom in on some specific areas like charter schools, student loans, and even hot-button topics like critical race theory.
Absolutely. Those are the nitty-gritty details where things get really interesting and potentially very controversial.
All right, let's dive into those specifics then, because I'm already feeling like this deep dive is getting pretty deep.
Let's do it. Let's start with charter schools. This chapter really pushes for rolling back a lot of the regulations, giving them more autonomy, more freedom to operate.
So less red tape, more room for charter schools to kind of do their own thing. I see the appeal, but what about accountability? Wouldn't less oversight lead to problems? How do they address that?
Well, they argue that accountability comes from parents having the power to choose, right? If a charter school isn't performing well, parents can simply choose another option. They believe that that market-driven approach, that competition,
Competition, right?
will ultimately lead to better outcomes for everyone.
So it's like a free market approach to education.
Mm.
Interesting. But let's move on to another hot topic, student loans. This chapter doesn't shy away from some controversy there.
No, not at all. They proposed some pretty big changes, including shifting student lending back to the private sector. Remember how that worked before 2010?
Yeah, vaguely.
Yeah.
A lot of people got burned, right?
Yeah.
High interest rates, shady practices, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. A lot of people ended up with loans they couldn't afford, and there were very few protections in place.
So this move, going back to private lending, that could be a huge win for private lenders.
Yeah.
But is it good for students? I don't know. It feels like we're going back to the Wild West of lending.
And that's a major concern that critics raise. They worry about, predatory lending practices, targeting vulnerable students, especially those from low-income backgrounds who might not have the same financial literacy or resources to navigate those complex loan terms.
Right. It's a tough balance.
Yeah.
Trying to make the system more sustainable long-term, but also protecting students from being saddled with unmanageable debt. It's their future on the line.
Absolutely. And the chapter goes even further, proposing to consolidate all those different federal loan programs into a single new program with stricter terms.
Okay, stricter how? Give me the details.
So they would eliminate things like interest rate subsidies and a lot of the existing loan forgiveness programs.
Well, hold on. They want to eliminate loan forgiveness altogether. But isn't that crushing for people who are already, buried in debt?
Yeah.
How do they justify that?
Their argument is that those programs, those subsidies and forgiveness programs, they actually distort the market and create this unfair burden on taxpayers. They believe that students should be responsible for repaying the loans they take out, plain and simple.
I mean, I can see both sides of that argument. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But what about parental rights? Where does that fit into their vision? Because we hear that a lot these days.
Yeah, empowering parents is really central to their plan. They call for a federal parents' Bill of Rights.
A Bill of Rights, huh?
To codify their right to direct their children's education.
So more, say, in, what the kids are learning, where they go to school, things like that.
Exactly. More transparency in curriculum, more choice in educational options, and really ensuring that their voices are heard in all these decisions that affect their children's education.
It sounds like they really want to shift the power dynamic, put more control in the hands of parents. But what about the students' voices? Don't they have a say in their own education?
That's a really good question, and one that critics of this approach often bring up. They argue that students, especially older students, should have a greater say in their education, and that focusing solely on parental rights ignores students' own agency and their right to make choices about their future.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's the students who are in the classroom experiencing the education firsthand.
Exactly.
So it goes back to that tension, right?
Yeah.
Between this idea of local control, parental rights, and the need to protect individual rights and ensure that everyone has a voice.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act, and there's no easy answer.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second that the Department of Education just disappears tomorrow. Poof, it's gone. What happens next? What are the real-world consequences, on the ground?
Well, I think one of the most immediate impacts would be this massive shift in responsibility.
Okay.
A lot of functions that are currently handled by the federal government, things like setting educational standards, distributing funding, overseeing things like teacher certification, all of that would suddenly fall to the states.
So a lot more variability across the country. Some states might prioritize early childhood education, while others might put more emphasis on vocational training, for example. We could end up with a real patchwork of different approaches, right?
Exactly. And that leads to both potential benefits and drawbacks, right? On the one hand, states would have more flexibility to tailor their education systems to the specific needs of their populations. But on the other hand, we could see this widening gap between states with robust education systems and those that struggle to provide quality education for all students.
Yeah, that equity concern is a big one, especially for those who worry that dismantling the Department of Education would disproportionately hurt students in low-income communities, communities that already face significant challenges.
And it's not just about funding, it's also about oversight, right?
Right.
The Department of Education plays a crucial role in enforcing federal civil rights laws that protect students from discrimination. Without that federal oversight, some worry we could see a rollback of those protections, which could have really serious consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about Title IXs and the potential impact on girls and women, but there are concerns about students with disabilities, students from minority groups, all kinds of vulnerable populations, really.
It's a valid concern, and it highlights the fact that dismantling the Department of Education isn't just about making government smaller, right?
It's about a lot more than that.
It's about changing who gets to make decisions about education and what values they prioritize.
It's a power shift, really.
Exactly. And that's why this conversation is so important. We need to move beyond the sound bites and political rhetoric and really grapple with the potential consequences of such a dramatic change.
Okay, so let's try to do that. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of, say, a teacher in a public school. How might their job change if the Department of Education just went away? Okay, so we're picturing this world, no Department of Education. How would that impact a teacher, like day to day in their classroom?
Well, their curriculum could look a lot different, for one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because states would be setting those standards, remember?
Right, right.
So you could have a teacher in Texas covering totally different material than a teacher in California, for example.
Wow, so much more variation across the country. What about things like their salary or the resources they have in the classroom? Would that change too?
It's definitely possible. Right now, the federal government provides a big chunk of funding for schools, especially in lower income areas.
Right.
But without the Department of Education, that money would likely be given to states as those block grants we talked about.
And then each state gets to decide how to divvy it up.
Exactly. Some might prioritize teacher salaries, while others might focus on things like infrastructure or technology.
Yeah, so a lot of uncertainty for teachers, potentially a lot of good, potentially a lot of bad, depending on where they are.
Yeah, and wouldn't that uncertainty trickle down to parents too? Especially with this whole idea of school choice?
Oh, right, right. Because if the Department of Education is gone, who's really ensuring that all these new school options are actually, quality options?
Exactly. This chapter is all about giving parents more choices, but it also raises some serious questions about equity.
Because if all the resources and the high-achieving students start concentrating in certain schools, it could leave others really struggling to keep up.
Right. And without the Department of Education there to enforce those federal protections, there's a real worry about discrimination creeping back into the system.
It's a valid concern. We've been talking about Title IX and the impact on girls and women, but this could affect students with disabilities, students from minority groups, really any vulnerable population.
It all comes back to this. Really, dismantling the Department of Education isn't just about shrinking the size of government. It's about fundamentally changing who gets to call the shots when it comes to education.
It's about values at the end of the day.
Exactly. And that's why this conversation is so important. We have to move beyond the slogans and the political rhetoric and really think about the potential consequences, both good and bad.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of that today, right? I mean, we've explored the arguments for and against this idea, and we've looked at what might actually happen on the ground if this proposal were to become reality.
We've thought about the impact on teachers, students, the whole educational landscape, really.
That before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
This whole chapter focuses on the federal government's role in education. But what about the influence of corporations and private interests? If the Department of Education goes away, does that create a void that those entities could fill?
That's a really interesting question. Would we see for-profit companies playing a bigger role in shaping curriculum or influencing what kids are learning? It's definitely something to consider.
Absolutely. And it's something we haven't fully explored today, but it's a crucial part of this larger conversation about the future of education.
Yeah, the takeaway here is that there are so many layers to this issue, so many different perspectives and potential outcomes.
This deep dive was really just a starting point.
Right, the tip of the iceberg.
Keep researching, keep questioning, and keep forming your own opinions because at the end of the day, the future of education is something we all have a stake in.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it informative and engaging.
And until next time, keep those brain cells firing.